Good morning. Today is, well, it's Thursday, January 29th. We are the Ways and Means Committee, in case anyone didn't know. We have two members who are keeping their germs to themselves and taking care of their bodies, and we appreciate both of those things, but they're on the Zoom. And today, we are going to go deep on the estate tax in the context of the FY27 budget. We heard a little bit about that yesterday from Commissioner Gresham. We're going to hear more about it from Pat Titterton at JFO. And then for the miscellaneous tax bill, we're going to have our annual conversation about the downtown and village center tax credit. At 11:15, we're going to talk about how we count the kids in the school. There is a luncheon at the Capitol Plaza with the Superintendent's Association. Highly encourage folks to go. And then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about reserve guidance. So it'll be like a little bit of a grab bag of a day.
Good to see.
And with that,
The meals. Good, just.
any announcements? Carol, did you have a good birthday?
I guess I.
Good, so really good. Pat, you want to join us?
Okay. So I am going to talk about a few things relating to the estate tax, a little bit of history, a little bit of how it works, a little bit about where the money goes. And then I have some numbers I can share with you all too. On the screen. So I guess first things first, Vermont does have an estate tax. We can confirm that. The feds also have an estate tax. I just wanted to start with them and talk a little bit about how that works for them. So estate taxes essentially is the value of all your assets when you die and they're being passed on. So from date of death, you have to file with the tax department telling them what the value of your assets are within 9 months. They do allow some extensions in situations where people need a little more time to get that together. But on the federal level, there is a graduated schedule, but the first $15 million, if you are an individual person, is exempt. So that amount, if you're below that threshold, is not taxed. And it's only the value of the assets above that 15 million. You can see the schedule here. So up to 10,000 above 15 million, it's taxed to 18%. That rate goes up to 40% once you're a million over the threshold.
I have a question already, and I feel like it's a very foolish question. I don't understand how you can have joint filing for an estate and like, is it two people pass at the same time? I don't understand.
That was my impression. I thought that was weird too.
Thank you.
I don't think that's an odd question. That was my impression.
It's if two people pass at the same time,
I believe.
like a couple who file together get in a car accident.
Unless it's a joint trust.
That could be another situation.
For me, will you look more into that?
I'm sure, yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
But yeah, so for a married couple or joint, for joint assets, it'd be up to 30 million. So again, it's only on the value above those thresholds that the feds are taxing these amounts. And so these were temporary, then made and expanded temporarily in TCJA. HR 1 made them permanent. And then also TCJA at the time had increased these amounts. So prior to TCJA, it was more like 5.5 million for single, about 11 million for a joint estate. So it is, in the last, since 2017, it's a big, basically tripling of that exemption threshold amount at the federal level.
I'm going to take this opportunity to encourage other people to join my particularly nerdy little journey on the choice about adding single and joint to any piece of tax policy sometimes makes a lot of policy sense and sometimes it doesn't, but we tend to do it automatically without regard to the policy intent or the implications. And so I just encourage people to actually pay attention to it because it sometimes becomes white noise because it's mentioned with like almost all tax policy. Onwards, sorry.
That's actually, so, sorry.
No, it is interesting about jointly owned assets. And if there's a couple and one person dies, then the other person does not have to pay estate tax if it's a jointly owned asset until they pass. So that's why it's 39. So if it's two people. Just kind
Yeah.
of thinking it through as to
Yeah.
how that would work.
I will double confirm that,
Yeah.
but logically that makes sense. But that was a good segue because Vermont does it a little differently. Irregardless of how many people we're talking about, Vermont has a $5 million threshold. So again, only the value of assets over and above that 5 million, Vermont taxes at a rate of 16%. And in a couple slides, I'll tell you why we chose the number 16%. Yeah, so Vermont's thresholds or threshold is much more similar to what the feds had in pre-TCJA, although in 2019, 2020, and I think 22, it was sort of increased on a graduated basis. And we can see what those numbers were prior.
Also like an extra exemption for farm property.
Born or
Farm, like ag.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't notice that.
Need to look at those details again, though. I haven't looked at it in a while.
You could just say that's in the field.
Oh, it's like the day just started.
highly oriented.
Don't get back to this.
Yes, I got
But since you brought it up, are they going to look at that?
Pat's gonna look at it, yes.
Yeah, I don't have anything in this here, but I'll look at farm.
Yeah.
Good question. Why an estate, why would you, if you've got a great deal of money, you want to preserve it, why would you put it in an estate? Why wouldn't you have maybe a trust fund? And I wonder whether things are shifting away maybe from states to trust. I'm just curious.
So I think maybe a CPA might be a little more qualified than me to talk about something like that. But, you know, it is certainly something very wealthy people do utilize as trusts. I know there's a lot of options, we'll put it that way, for tax treatability when you go some of those routes. But I mean, I guess I don't have additional information on that right now.
I just.
It's certainly a good question to ask.
I'm curious, and also curious whether taxes on estates is maybe going down as maybe people find other ways.
And we can take more testimony about it because it's a very interesting question.
I don't know if it's
Legal tax avoidance.
in the next few slides. I do have some historical estate tax receipts on the Vermont level. But as I mentioned, so the Vermont threshold has increased in the past. So in 2020, it increased from 2.75 million to 4.25 million. And then it again increased from 4.25 million to 5 million, where we are today. That's a static amount. So whereas the federal amounts are indexed to inflation, Vermont is static. And we do this in a few other areas of tax law where we keep things static rather than growing by inflation. But in effect, what that does end up doing is because it's not pegged to inflation in real dollar terms, that threshold amount goes down over time, right? In nominal terms, it's constant, stays the same. And so, but in real dollar terms, I know you've had Joyce and Julia here to talk about inflation and all that. So hopefully that.
We're actually gonna do it again.
Excellent. So maybe that's a good thing to keep in the back of your head when you hear about that again. So yeah, we're at $5 million is the threshold now. Before 2001, all 50 states actually had an estate tax. And this is actually an interesting thing to think about also as an example, because I know you've been talking about coupling, decoupling, and that sort of stuff. But prior to that, the federal government had provided a credit up to 16% of a state's value for state estate taxes. So remember, Vermont taxes at 16%, right? What states would do is they would just link up to the federal credit amount, set their tax rate equal to the federal amount. Because in effect, what that was doing was maximizing the amount of money that the states brought in without changing the total amount of federal plus state taxes that the estates were paying. It's really hard to say state and estate in the same sentence. But in the in the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, which was passed in 2001, they phased out that credit amount. So by 2005, it was completely gone. They replaced it with a small deduction that really didn't offset that. But because states were all linked, coupled with the federal treatment, in effect, over that period of 2001 to 2005, their estate taxes were going down because they were linked up, and if they didn't act, it just went away. So today, this is basically the list of states that chose to decouple and implement their own estate tax policy. You can see that there's a lot of vestiges of historical treatment. A lot of these states still had that 16% rate that they had just because they were historically linked up to the federal amount. There's a few states, Connecticut, Hawaii, Washington, a few others that chose to go with different rates because they said maybe, well, there's no actual reason for 16%. We can kind of pick whatever we want now. And so they did. And you can also see that the exemption thresholds vary quite a bit. Connecticut, they have a almost double or twice as large exemption threshold, whereas Oregon is only at $1 million. So it's the value of assets over and above $1 million there. In Oregon and Connecticut, it's the value of assets over and above 9.1 million. So Vermont kind of sits sort of right around the middle in terms of where our threshold is at compared to the states that have an estate tax.
You don't
Surprised how low New York is.
have New Hampshire on there.
The Tax Policy Center did not either.
0.
Oh, New Hampshire. They really go at it their own way, don't they?
But there are plenty of other New England states on here, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so talking about some of the numbers. So in statute, in any fiscal year in which the general fund surplus, in which there is a general fund surplus, so above the forecast, and the general fund stabilization reserve is fully funded, required at its statutory level. Funds that are raised on the estate tax levied under Chapter 32 that are more than 125% of the amount projected by the emergency board in the July annual forecast. So this is what I know Commissioner Gresham was in here talking with you about yesterday. So any time when the estate tax goes above 125% of what was forecasted, there's an automatic mechanism that sends those funds to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. And so how often does that trip? Well, in the last 10 years, it's been twice. I did find some examples in the earlier 2000s where, so maybe in the last 20 years, it's happened 6 or 7 times that it's gone above 125%. But you can see last year, and maybe why this has become a topic of interest, we had one of the highest performing years for the estate tax. So in that year, we were $26.4 million above 125% of the forecasted amount. So total receipts was 55.2 million. I think at the time, Tom Cavett told me that the Vermont received the single largest estate tax payment last year, which contributed to a lot of this. So I guess one way to think about that too is the revenue is extremely random. You know, it depends on who's passing, what they're passing with, in terms of assets and, you know, what the tax treatment or sort of the structure of their estate is, right? So,
Muslim?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. As a state college trustee, just for the purposes of the discussion around the table I noted with great interest in the amount of money that's available for scholarships for UVM, BTSU, BSTEC. If we dig into this, I'd be curious to know how efficiently we raise that revenue. I suppose since it's part of the estate tax, it would be a different discussion if we wanted to broaden the discussion to talk about more efficient ways of raising revenue for scholarships. I'm just saying for the record, I take an interest in this topic quite a bit, so no need to dwell on it now, but BTSU and UVM and BSAC are certainly grateful for the amount of money that's available for scholarships.
And the Commerce and Ed have a hearing.
We have a joint hearing at 10 in room 11, which I'm gonna go to, and
About this.
about this, because this is managed as an endowment that is allowed to do either 2.5% or 5% of assets in any given year to BSAC, UVM, and the state colleges. And so there's the question about how this is funded. There's also the question about whether funds are pulled out of it for a specific project this year at UVM, which is not related to scholarship.
Okay, so, thank you.
I read recently where I think the treasurer's office presented several scholarships to all of the Vermont State University schools, UVM and such. But that was from the treasurer. Was that what's this?
Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund.
Endowment Trust. That's the treasurer's office.
yeah, so if you want to learn like a real deep dive on that trust fund, the treasurer's office are the ones that administer.
Those scholarships went to the student, not to the.
Yeah, sorry. So, and I have a little more information on this later, but the treasurer is in charge of administering the fund, but they do distribute the funds directly to those institutions for them to do the actual granting of financial aid. Yeah.
And if one person wants to join Representative Burkhart to go downstairs to that, they're welcome to. If more than one person goes, we're gonna have quorum problems because we have two people out sick.
I'll Bridget, just keep me in the loop, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Onward. And so a little quick caveat about this table is this is the information I got directly from the tax department. They pulled it out of VSAC or VTax. It doesn't match up with what we saw on the previous slide because they organize it there in terms of date of death. So that comes into play when tracking, I mentioned earlier that people have 9 months to file with the tax department after date of death. They do allow some extension. So these are all tied to date of death. With that said, every year there are more filers than there are actual payers of the estate tax. Part of the reason I think has to do with, verifying value if you're close to the threshold. Is there some language in the miscellaneous tax bill about this from the administration? There might be.
Verifying the value of estates?
No, around who has to file.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
So that distinction there is partially related to that. But you can see in any given year, there's about 40 to 60 people who actually end up paying the estate tax. 2025 numbers are preliminary, partially due to that 9-month thing that's going on there. But you can see that in an average year, estate taxes are around, or sorry, the average estate tax paid is around 250,000. And so far this year, the average payment amount has been about $1 million. Again, that's preliminary, but you can see that if so, you know, in 23, 60 different estates contributed $25 million. That averaged to about 400,000 in state estate taxes in that year per estate that was required to pay. But yeah, I mean, you could see that over time, it has been sort of generally growing, but on a very inconsistent basis. Some big spikes, some troughs, not necessarily the most consistent tax type we have on the books. And just to reiterate, in the last 10 years, it's only been above that 125% threshold twice. Okay, so this also ties very directly into Vermont's demographic picture. So this figure here is from a report on household wealth that Joyce Manchester wrote 2 years ago, I think. Maybe last
I
year.
have no time anymore. It's gone.
This is just showing the average and median household wealth by age group. So you can see the younger you are, the lower it is, up until about the ages 65 to 74. That's when wealth typically really peaks in most households, and this is national data. But then as households start to draw down on retirement accounts, that amount on average and the median amount does decrease. But you can see that wealth in the US is definitely much more highly concentrated at the older side of the population. And why does that matter for Vermont? We are an aging state. You can see here, so the blue line is 2020, the green line is 2023, and this is the shift in age, Vermonters' age over that time. One thing I want to draw your attention to is this sort of large blob or mound that is slowly moving towards older years. And so these are people who are going to be transitioning into what we saw on this slide, their highest period of household net wealth. I don't know how to put this sort of in a nice way, but
Talk about it delicately. Yeah,
delicately.
please go on in.
But these are also people who are approaching
The time they might file for an estate tax.
I like that. You might have to file for an estate tax. So yeah, and so Vermont is an aging state, and we have a lot of people who are moving into this period of their life. A large amount of health held by this group. I'm not going to tell you there's going to be a big influx of estate tax receipts. However, if you draw some connections and patterns between these different slides, you might reasonably think that there could be a larger number of people filing for estate taxes in the coming years.
And just for the record, unrelated to the estate tax, those two graphs together are one of the reasons that I think that an income-based education tax won't work. So I just want to, that an income-based education tax won't work. Yes.
I have a question somewhat related to that, which is what happens if you have a second home or chunk of your estate that's in Vermont?
Yeah.
And you are technically a resident of Florida or North Carolina or something. How does estate tax work in that case? Like, where's the nexus for the estate tax, or does it just get divided up? Assets are here, assets are there, and you pay those different states according to their.
I wish Kirby was here right now, because that's another, relating back to the question about trust, that's another area that has some nuance to it, I know. I would venture to guess, but I don't want to be wrong.
Okay. We can take more testimony
Yeah.
on some of that. And also we're going to talk about estate versus inheritance
Yes.
taxes in a minute. And I think that also gets into that.
Madam Chair, could I ask a quick question?
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. I didn't see your yellow hand.
No, you're
there.
good. I know with the screen sharing. Might also be a question for Kirby, but off of Representative Burkhart's point, how is asset value calculated for purposes of the estate tax? Like there's the easy ones like the car and the house that are worth X amount of dollars, but like what about the jewelry box in the house, et cetera? So curious as to what goes into the calculation of assets for purposes of the estate tax.
So I don't know about the jewelry box. For something like a brokerage account or a retirement account, they'll often pick the date of death, and sort of freeze the value of those assets at that point for doing the total valuation. Because obviously with like market accounts like that, they're going to go up and down every day. So in an instance like that, they'll usually pick a date when to value the assets. I don't know about the jewelry box. I assume if you have a huge art collection at some point, fine art, at some point, you're probably going to have them valued for purposes of insurance. Yep.
Yeah.
So that could be one way, but yeah, I might defer to someone with a little more knowledge than me on that specific part of it.
So in addition to hearing from Kirby, we'll hear from some accountant types on how such things work.
Pat, when you were showing the other graph about the number of estate tax filers, given the grid that you just showed in terms of people aging, you would expect that number to continue to grow. If there are still wealthy people among those that have more than 15 or $5 million and an estate, but that number, at least for 3 years, which is not a trend, it is a trend, but not long enough. If that number keeps going down, then that might point to something. And if because it should go by demographics, it should be going up.
Well, and one thing I just to remember when looking at this particular chart, remember earlier, I had that slide talking about how in 2020 and 2021, Vermont actually increased the threshold, which would have pushed some people below it, which could factor into the number of filers you see there.
Good point.
But I know you all had have had conversations about correlation and causation. I'm seeing some correlation between some of these things. I don't think you can necessarily draw a direct link because yes, they do have to file for an estate tax, but they also still have to be over the threshold. We might have people in that period of their life, but we can presume that we'll have more people who are above that threshold when we look at some of this data, but we don't for sure.
This may not be a question for you either, but so when you talk about these filers, who are they? I mean, the family members, what if there's no family members? Who are the filers then?
So presumably the executor of the estate is required to sort of do the valuation and submitting the tax forms to the tax department. The tax is levied on the estate itself. And there's a little maybe we can go. I have some slides talking about sort of what is an estate tax, what is an inheritance tax. So we can actually jump right into that.
Okay.
So I guess I'll just say it. Estate taxes are levied on the estate itself. So the estate being the entity that is taxed, then the value of its assets prior to any distributions to beneficiaries. Inheritance tax kind of captures it at the next step rather than prior to distribution. So inheritance taxes are levied on the beneficiaries themselves who are receiving the assets, and they're taxed up based on the value of their share of the assets they receive. Interestingly, from 1955 to 1971, Vermont had one of these. And I thought this part was funny. In chapter 32, there is a subsection in there that I guess has been in there since 1971 that just references the repeal of this estate tax.
It references the repeal?
Yeah, it just says inheritance tax below that repealed. So it's been in there for a really long time. But yeah, so the most important distinction is who is paying the tax. So for the estate tax, it's the estate itself. and the inheritance tax, it is the beneficiary. And I'll talk about how some states do have inheritance tax and it's treated a little differently. But I think, part of that distinction maybe relates a little bit to Representative Burkhart's question about, where you live, basically, or where the assets themselves are housed. Under an inheritance tax system, if I have a relative who passed in Tennessee, they left me money in Vermont, and Vermont has an inheritance tax, I would pay an inheritance tax in the state of Vermont. But conversely, if we had a Vermonter who passed and their beneficiaries were in Massachusetts or somewhere else, Vermont wouldn't be capturing that without an estate tax. Okay.
Just a thought, if I had a huge estate, I think I'd start putting some of my assets, naming the beneficiaries beforehand and have them named within the, if I had properties, I'd try to get away from paying some of these taxes by having my relatives, named as, co-owner with me. With my properties.
Yeah, there are a lot of
And-
ways to manage.
And I don't know, there's probably no way of taxing those individuals that are paying attention.
I can't remember.
Not yet anyways.
There is.
Okay.
We're
I
also,
think we need
we're,
to get CPA.
we're gonna, so we will take more testimony
Just-
from both the CPA and from Kirby. And tomorrow we have testimony on compliance and the tax department. And so I think these are also interesting questions for them.
Yeah, one thing.
Because there's sort of, there's legal avoidance and then there's on the edge of legal avoidance and then, yeah.
Well, and that's also, as we're getting older, many of us may
Only
end
some of
up
us.
in the nursing homes or assisted living homes. And before you go into those areas, you probably want to start moving some of your assets from your control into somebody else's.
We should hear testimony on that too, I think.
We will hear more testimony on how the estate tax avoidance, which is what I am gonna, yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Also, is why people do have trusts, because very often a trust, you could have a modest amount that's certainly under this back of your children, or you just want to avoid probate. So I think we need to hear
We will.
all these things.
Yes. And we have heard a lot of trust testimony in the past when updates have happened to trust law, but having a holistic look to center that would be helpful.
Yeah, I guess just quickly anecdotally, I don't look at it very often, but whenever I have been in grand list data, there's a lot of houses that have ownership under, XYZ Family Trust is the name of the owner. So there are states with with inheritance taxes, and some of them do administer it differently. Two examples I pulled. So New Jersey, surviving spouses, parents, children, and grandchildren are all completely exempt from this tax. However, siblings, nieces or nephews, and other beneficiaries would pay 16% on their share of assets that they receive as a beneficiary. In Pennsylvania, surviving spouses are exempt, and adult direct descendants pay 4.5% tax, and then siblings pay 12%, and the other heirs pay 15%. So just a couple of states that do it differently. And one thing that seems fairly consistent among states that do have an inheritance tax is they do vary the rate based on the relation to the deceased. So it's, I guess, one lever they use for any particular policy feelings they have about tax treatment and relationship to the deceased. But this is just a map of who has what. I do want to do a little more digging on Maryland because they somehow have both. And I'm not quite sure how that works in terms of when you think about wanting to avoid double taxation of things. But you know, in Vermont, or I guess in the Northeast, outside New Hampshire, all those states have an estate tax, which we saw earlier. There's 12 total who have one. Presumably, well, actually, all of the states that don't have an estate tax now either did nothing, and when the federal phase out of the credit went away, their tax rate effectively went to zero, or they just opted to appeal it outright. So that is sort of the national look. Generally speaking, estate taxes are easier to administer because, and part of that is because they generally apply to fewer people, and historically were structured to align with federal tax rules. So it's sort of a well-defined process that states could kind of just pick up where the feds left off and kind of continue administering it in the same way. But, you know, I think really the crux of the administratability of it is you're really talking about just the one entity, and particularly in situations where they could be a half dozen or a dozen beneficiaries. So from that perspective, you know, it's just taxing the value of the assets before any distribution. You're really only working with one entity. Is a simple way to put that. But you know, there's some flexibility with inheritance taxes that you can tailor the rate that people are paying based on their relationship to the deceased. And I have seen a couple of arguments that inheritance taxes do sort of more directly tie the tax with the individual's ability to pay. And sort of, yeah,
What do you mean?
so
Sorry.
if you get a lot from this tax or from an estate, as opposed to someone else who's receiving some funds from it, you are going to be. Sorry, let me back up for a sec. The estate tax in most other states, they have graduated schedules. So it's more of a marginal tax bracket rate. So if it's a big estate and they're getting hit at the highest marginal rate, for someone who's receiving a relatively small portion of that estate, it's sort of an indirect way where they could be getting taxed at a higher rate than they would have otherwise under an inheritance tax.
That makes sense. But it's not. So if an estate was divided evenly and one of the beneficiaries had a lower income themselves than the other, that's not what you're referring to. Okay.
Yeah, this kind of looks outside. I mean,
Yeah, it's outside someone's other financial picture.
yeah, if you inherit like an IRA account, you'll still be, when you take distributions from that, you'll be paying income taxes on that, but this is just sort of a standalone tax type. So that was inheritance tax and estate tax. I was just have a few slides talking about where the money goes in Vermont currently if we get above that threshold. So statute does provide the state treasurer with the ability to distribute 5% of the fund's 12-quarter moving average value, and it's divided equally between UVM, VSC, and VSAC. Those entities can only use those funds to provide non-loan financial aid to Vermont students attending Vermont post-secondary institutions. There is an additional amount that the Trust Fund Council and the Secretary of Administration can approve up to 2% more, split equally between UVM and VSC, and that's for endowment donation matching. So it's to support their endowments. And importantly, so the 5% and 2% distributions that the treasurer's office can make, that can only be made from the earnings in the trust fund account. It can't be made from the principal. So, you know, basically what that does is it just protects the perpetuality of the trust fund account so it can continue to make these distributions going forward. In another slide, I have the balance from the last two reports that their office has released. But yeah, again, it's by doing it in that way and not dipping into the estate tax revenue that's been deposited, the actual principal amount, it just allows it to either keep growing over time and continue to be able to make it, or just be able to maintain sort of the service it's providing now.
Patrick. If UVM, VSC, and VSAC, that's dated language, VSC is now Vermont State Universities.
I should update that.
Okay, and then that would,
TSU, if you want to use.
Okay.
but that would include Randolph, VTC, Vermont Community College, and the three others.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
They're all part of ETSU.
And then for transparency, you're a trustee of the state colleges and you're a trustee of UVM and you're on this
The council.
council. Okay.
Okay.
It's based on.
Did I miss anyone? I didn't miss any, you're not on. Okay, great, okay.
Just lives in a town that happens to have.
Okay, thank you.
About former trustee.
That's, we could never, I mean, I think Charlie was class president at UVM at some point. Yeah.
Okay, so we left off at protecting the principal amount so it can continue to do this moving forward. In 2024, distributions funded 675 scholarships, averaging $1,400 per student. 73% of those scholarships were awarded to first-generation students. And then also in that report, in fiscal year 2025, the fund's portfolio posted a gain of 11.4%. Which is why they were able to approve that full 7% distribution amount, totaling $2.6 million. So from that amount, UVM, VTSU, and VSAC each received about $600,000 for the non-loan financial aid. And then UVM and VTSU also received just a little under $400,000 for their endowment support.
Adapting on the language.
And I just pulled the two balance sheets from the last two reports that the treasurer's office publishes. You can see, and this connects back to that chart when I showed you how many years we have tripped that 125% threshold. In the opening balance for 2024, there was no transfer of estate tax into this trust fund. And I have that sort of box there in red. But then you see that large influx that we saw last year, the 26.4 million over and above that 125% threshold. You see where it shows up in the balance of the trust fund there. And it really is quite a significant jump in the funding that is in this account. You can see prior it was about $37 million in principal balance that was in the account. And so this is almost the transfer this past year almost doubles that amount that's in the trust fund. So it is, in the context of the size of the fund, a fairly significant increase in the amount of money that is in there.
Are these scholarships just for students or is it anybody?
Yeah, so what I found was that financial aid to Vermont students attending Vermont's post-secondary institutions. Yeah.
Well, we're on the transparency kick. I think my daughter gets one of these. Wait, did you have something, Bridget? No.
Do you have a slide of history of the distributions? No.
I don't have a slide, but it's in the reports and I could compile that if you
I
want.
was wondering now. It's a loaded question, but I'm trying to, just thinking about the demand is not limited. So just trying to phrase it the right way, so that if the distribution from the fund at 5% of whatever the earnings, maybe it's $3 million a year. It's not that the need is only $5 million a year in total. It's unlimited, I would think, in terms of the financial aid that is needed by Vermont students or by the universities that are recipients of the fund. That's what I'm trying to convey. So there's no upper limit.
That probably is the question more for one of the entities that receives the distributions or maybe the treasurer's office.
And what is the unmet need at this point?
But I did see in one of the reports, I think it was, they do sort of focus a lot of these scholarships on sort of like that last mile connection, like let's just bridge this last piece of the gap to get you to be able to come here. So that's why, in the context of how much is tuition these days, $1,400 is, not insignificant, but it kind of falls in comparison to the total cost.
Representative Maslin.
Yes, Representative Kimball's question is appropriate. And yes, the unmet need is ongoing, particularly as small colleges like ETSU and also UVM are trying to increase enrollment as demographics change. And so as much as is available, ETSU, for example, can use appropriately for first generation Vermonters and others who need the resources. And I ought to speak up a little bit for those out there somewhere, but anyway, but thank you.
Will we have time to take testimony from BTSU or?
Yeah.
Especially UVM is interesting because UVM benefits from this, but then there's also in the governor's proposed budget, $15 million to come out of the assets of this to go to UVM for a specific project.
So our responsibility is the money that comes in, and other people's responsibility is the money that goes out. And so when you and Representative Odie and whoever else watches the testimony later in those two committees sees a spot where that makes sense, let me know. But I don't want to step on the toes of those other two committees, who I think are both feeling very diligent about this issue. Any other questions for Pat? The thing I'm sitting with is this idea that sort of a wealthy generation is shifting along that axis, and what that means for how we want to be planning for the future as a state. Thank you. We have a break until 10:15.
Yes.
Yes.